It's my pleasure to be here this evening with so many friends and neighbors. When Miss Tracy sent the invitation, I said yes immediately. Any chance to leave Washington City and come back to Ohio is a good excuse for me. I love being in this part of the country. Washington is a bit unsettling for those of us that are shy and more reserved. There's a lot of expectation there. So I'm so pleased that you can join me on this crisp April evening in 1881. Now, I was asked to come here and talk a bit about what it's been like to be an Ohio girl in Washington. And I think that I'm quite a bit like most of you. I am an educated lady that is from the Western Reserve of Ohio, and I would guess that many of you in the audience are likewise. I grew up on my father's farm in Garrettsville in Portage County. My parents there, Arabella and Zeb Rudolph, and a picture of me in my younger days back in 1854 when we had the double parts. Ladies, do you remember those? Mrs. Lincoln famously had her hair like that for her wedding day. So that was the style of the day. But like most of you, I grew up in a family with chores and responsibilities. I was the oldest of 4 children. And here are my 3 siblings. Ellen is at your far left. We call her Nellie. And then John and Joseph. So I was the oldest of the 4 children. So that means lots of chores and lots of what my mother called self-government. The result was I grew up very shy. My family was very serious. There was not cuddling in my household. In fact, I don't ever remember my father's embrace, and my mother rarely kissed me. So we had a serious family, but we were religious, and they believed highly in education. So once my siblings and I went to the local schools, I went off to the Geauga Seminary in Chester Township. And it was the first place I crossed paths with a young man from Orange Township named James A. Garfield. Then we were both at the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute in Hiram, Ohio. In fact, I was in the very first class, very first semester there in the fall of 1850, for my father, Zeb, was one of the trustees that helped start the school. Once I met James Garfield, I've had to travel fast and think even faster just to keep within seeing distance of him. He was always the first in our class. He wanted to be the top student, involved in very much of what was happening on the campus at the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, now Hiram College. We had a long courtship, and finally, in the spring of 1858, we decided to try a life in union. And we married at my father's home there, right on the hill in Hiram, for he had moved us away from Garrettsville, a few miles away, to Hiram to be closer to the college. And so our wedding took place in this humble farmhouse. I even sent Mr. Garfield an invitation, I have to admit, because we wanted to make sure he showed up. We started our married life in Mrs. Northrup's boarding school in Hiram. We had very little. We had boarders living with us, and we couldn't afford our own home or a honeymoon at that time. And our first child, Eliza Arabella, named after our mothers, was born when we were at the boarding house. We called her Little Trot, after a character in a Dickens novel. And you can just imagine her toddling around, and Little Trot was the appropriate nickname. Mr. Garfield has nicknames for everyone. Well, during the Civil War, after I had moved back home with my parents briefly, the general and I rented a house from Mr. Brown, Owen Brown, and finally we did the mathematics and realized it would be cheaper to purchase this house outright. And so we did. And while the general was away at the front lines, I was fixing up the house to be the best little home it could be for when he returned. And I enlisted the help of my father, Zeb, superintending the work since he was an excellent carpenter in the area. towards 1863, our life changed a great deal. First of all, the general was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives while he was at war. And he had a conundrum. It would look terrible if he left the field. So he got advice from none other than President Lincoln, who told him that he could find other generals, that he needed his assistance in Congress to help conclude the war, pay off the debt, and get to a peacetime army. And so my husband, in December, would be taking his seat in Congress. Just the month before that, well, 2 months before that, in October, we had our first son, Harry Augustus, named after two of Mr. Garfield's friends. But shortly after that, we were devastated by little Trot's death at 3.5 years old from diphtheria. This is her headstone that is in the Fairview Cemetery in Hiram. So I stayed home in Hiram with young Hal while the general went off to join Congress and take his seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. He was alone. He was, of course, in grief. And it was the custom of the time that the congressman's family stayed home in the district, and the congressmen themselves went off to board in Washington during the sessions of Congress. And so that's what he did. That's what the custom was, especially for the freshman congressman. And this is the Washington that he saw at that time. Pretty much a provincial, small town. Some folks called it a backwater. It wasn't the least bit cityfied, and you had a swampy area, and you had canals and rivers with refuse and such in it. Not the most pleasant place to have the capital of your nation, I would guess. So I stayed in Ohio. James went and boarded with Jacob Dolson Cox and some other men as they prepared to work in the Congress for that session, December through July. Shortly after that, we lived in furnished rented homes because Mr. Garfield decided that he did not want to leave his home, his family, I should say, back home in the 19th district here in Ohio. We realized in the first 4.5, 5 years of our marriage, we had only lived together 20 weeks. With the war, with other obligations that he had, he was a state senator going to Columbus before the war. He was away from home a great deal. And so to have him away again as a congressman, he decided that we should move the little family to Washington and rent a house and stay there with him. So this is what a typical boarding house in Washington looked like in 1863 or so, 1864 and 5. Does anyone recognize this building? Our Civil War enthusiasts in the group? This is Mrs. Surratt's boarding house that becomes notorious in a different story, not my story. But it is a very good example of what a boarding house looked like, where the congressmen and their families could live. And this is what the House of Representatives looked like, the interior, in 1866, with each of the congressmen having a desk as their office. If you needed to meet with Congressman Garfield, you would find him at his desk and conduct your business. Of course, the spittoon was there as well, and the cigar smoke in the room, and all the chatter that went along with a crowd of people. But this is very much what the interior of the U.S. Capitol looked like at that time. My husband was reelected a number of times, so with his position secure in the Congress, we decided that we would build a home in Washington. We didn't have enough money to do this, however, so we had to borrow money from good friend David Swaim, one of my husband's Army buddies. And he loaned us the money to get started on this brick house at the corner of 13th and I Streets. Now, I headed back to Ohio while some of the construction was taking place on this house. But my husband had to stay for an extra meeting of the Committee of the Census. So he wrote that he was driving by the site every day. I watched the spadefuls of earth going out to make way for us and our little ones, he said. And our 3-story brick house was completed in 1869, not far from Franklin Square. And a couple of our children were born here. Whenever there was a recess of Congress, however, we headed back to Ohio. We were like vagabonds yearly, where we packed up certain belongings and took them back and forth between Washington and Ohio. We would go back to our home in Hiram for a number of years until we sold that to good friend Burke Hinsdale. Sometimes you would find us at my parents' farmhouse in Hiram. By the way, I brought my stereopticon slides, and so far I think they have been a success. My assistant said that they could display them so that you could see them all at one time, and I wouldn't have to pass the stereopticon around individually and take the time. So I hope that the slides are working out for everyone in the room. But this is very much the typical gathering of Garfields and Rudolphs at my father's house on the Hiram Hill. Sometimes you would find us at Little Mountain when we were back in Ohio. At the Lakeview House, which a very nice hotel. Some of the important men from Ohio would be there, especially some of the Cleveland businessmen. Mr. Wade was one of them that my husband played chess with on occasion. And it was the perfect setting for young children. You know, Mr. Garfield loved to take the family out to the ledges and teach them a bit about geology, a bit about botany, about the animals in the area. And it was cooler than Cleveland, of course. It had a bit of elevation to it. So that was a wonderful respite for us from the summers in Washington City. The Lakeview House was very popular. You can see a number of folks out front. The red star is my husband there in the top hat. We spent a few summers that way. You know, ladies, it seems like it would be a time off, a little bit of a vacation. But you know, when you're in a different place without all your household belongings, it's almost a bit more work to live like this with a family of small children. But there was usually some extra help around. Finally, Mr. Garfield decided he would build a small cabin there, and we did have our own little cabin up on Little Mountain for a couple of summers. Back in Washington in December each year, our house was added to in 1878 because we had Molly. I'm sorry, let's go back. Hal was born 1863. Then our Jimmy came along in 1865. Molly was born in 67. Irvin in 70. Abram in 72. And little Edward the day after Christmas in 1874. So you see, we had a household of children. So an addition was very appropriate, and by that time we had some money saved where we could add on to the house. This was an ideal location with the park right across the street and the executive mansion not too far away, the Capitol not too far away. Here's our young ones. So left side, that's little Jimmy. You can recognize him frequently by a scowl expression on his face. He's our moody child. We're never sure if Jimmy is going to be pleasant and happy when he wakes up in the morning or if he's going to look a bit sour. His older brother Hal is standing there with a more classical pose, don't you think? And then dear little Molly is at the top, the girl in the middle of all these boys. The boys on the right-hand side in their little knickers, Irvin on the left and Abram on the right. And then little Edward is down below Molly. So those are our children. And the red dot star shows you where our house was located, right on the corner of 13th and I Streets. I say was because now, of course, we're in the executive mansion. I hope one day we might get back there, but I don't know that we will or not. We have rented it out for the time being, but perfect for a family, so your children could go across to the park at Franklin Square. The older boys were attending the Franklin School right there near the park. And then later on, they went to the Emerson Institute, sometimes referred to as Mr. Young's School. So that was within walking distance of our house. Also, the Madam Burr's Finishing School for young ladies was very close by. Molly walks there to attend classes. And here's an extra person that's living with us in that large home. This is Congressman Garfield's mother, Eliza Ballou Garfield. She enjoyed living with us in Washington for those sessions of Congress starting in about 1867. She got to see the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson, and she would frequently write to her daughters and her nieces about the sights that she was seeing in Washington. The church we attend is the Vermont Avenue Disciple of Christ Church. And I have to say that Mr. Garfield and I are a bit disappointed in the congregation tripling since we have been made President and First Lady. It seems that many folks are showing up on Sunday mornings, filling the pews, really to get a look at the President and our family. I'm not sure they're actual churchgoers, members of the church, but the church is packed every Sunday recently. One of the things we love to do with the children is to put them in a carriage and take them for a ride out to the old soldiers' home. Mr. Garfield feels it's very important for them to meet the Civil War veterans who live there, for the boys to understand the story a bit more. And then we take a quick little jaunt over to Calorama Park, a beautiful carriage ride, especially this time of the year when you have the flowering trees and you have the beautiful spring weather. One of our favorite entertainments is to go to Ford's Theater. We have seen many excellent productions there. Mr. Garfield and I read from Lamb's Shakespeare book to the children before we attend some of the performances. It's very helpful because the Lambs have written the stories in a manner that children can understand the plot. And so we are frequenters of Ford's Theater. One of the other nice activities that you can do as parents is to belong to a literary society. We are in the one that is in the home of Mrs. Sarah Dahlgren. This year, Mr. Garfield is the president of our literary society. We choose a topic every year, and we have wonderful speakers, authors, poets. Sometimes we have musical entertainment or a play or a skit of sorts. And this is one of those wonderful things I think you can all agree that you can do once your children start getting a bit older and you and your spouse can go and be part of an adult group again, in this case, the Literary Society of Washington. Sunday dinners. Whether we were at our 13th and I Street or whether we're in the President's house now, Sunday dinners have been a mainstay for our family. We have many visitors that come from Ohio and spend some time with us. Charles Henry from Pond, Ohio, near Geauga Lake, comes to see us frequently. He's in the upper left. Dr. Silas Boynton is to the right of the title, my husband's cousin. He and his wife Ann spend quite a bit of time with us as well. And then Carolyn Ransom is the artist in the blue dress, a good friend of the family. She's painted many of the portraits of our family members, including the one you saw of the President's mother just a few frames ago. Now, Giles Harbor, the handsome young man at the top right, was the first person that my husband appointed to the Naval Academy, one of those nice jobs that you get as a congressman. And Mr. Harbor graced us with his presence on many Sundays, filling up our table. And in my heart, I secretly hoped that he and Miss Ransom might strike up a Courtship. They are different ages, I will admit, but so far that has not happened. Then the folks on the bottom you might recognize as our neighbors in Painesville, the Steeles. George and Horace and their wives. They came to see us on a number of occasions. Sometimes it was on business. The Steeles had a conversation with Congressman Garfield, trying to get him to help them accomplish some things. And then Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, the former president and first lady. You know, when my husband was a congressman, the Hayeses would have us over to their house, the president's house, for dinner on occasion. And my husband, as a fellow Republican, tried his best to help Mr. Hayes with his agenda. The same with former President Grant. So we were in Washington for each of those presidencies, where my husband had a big role in their administration, I guess you could say. One of the other delightful things to do with children is to take them to the Smithsonian Institution. The castle housed some beautiful works of art by Mr. Audubon. And my husband took the boys and Molly to see these paintings of birds. Again, a bit of education, but also a fun outing for the youngsters. Well, coming back home in 1876 was quite different for us because, as happens, Portage County was lopped off of the 19th district that my husband represented. That left us without a home in the county. And so we had to go look for another home. Now, Lake County was added to the 19th district. And our good friend, Dr. Robeson, lived right up on Menor Avenue, and he said that my husband should go visit the Dickey farm, that the widow there was in the process of selling her farm. And so I was still in Washington. He made the trip to Mentor. He visited several times with the widow Dickey and with her brother-in-law George. And I received a letter. So, my darling, you shall have a home and a cow. And that's how I knew that he had made the deal with Mrs. Dickey to purchase her farm. Almost 160 acres, was only a 9-room house at that point, very small. But that gave us a home in the country, and again, a perfect place for young children. My husband said it was the ideal place to teach the boys a good, hard day's work. So we moved in the spring of 1877. We had to enlarge it by the spring of 1880, and that's the house that you see here in this slide. It's a 2.5-story farmhouse with 20 rooms instead of the 9-room house that we started with. So we basically went up and made a bigger house out of it. The neighbors thought we had a new house built entirely, but we just went up and incorporated the footprint of the 9-room house within the bigger house. You can see our horse barn off to the left, and Menor Avenue is the dirt road in front of the fence. So now when we went home, that's where we would go home to. And that became the site of an important election, the presidential election of 1880. We didn't know when we did the enlargement of the house that it would become a visible national symbol. But the Republicans chose James Garfield as their candidate that summer in Chicago. And he came home to the newly enlarged house to conduct a front porch campaign right from our porch. Thousands of people came to Mentor. I tried to keep home life as normal as possible, only permitting dignitaries to come in, but most folks waited out on the lawn. And James Garfield obliged them by coming out onto the porch and giving them a wonderful, genuine welcome to our farm. The newspaper reporters and the neighbors dubbed it Lawn Field at that time, sort of a play on our name, Garfield, but also because so many folks were on our lawns and we had the farm fields behind the house. Thank you. We are moving ahead because now we have an important reason to go to Washington. In February of 1881, just a few months ago, we left our Menor farm and went from the depot here in Menor on February 28th and ended up at the Baltimore and Potomac Railway Station in Washington, now as the president-elect and his family. By 1881, we look a bit more cosmopolitan here in Washington. Many houses were built. It became spots for people that worked for the government. They had to have their housing. You see some streets laid out. It looks a bit more formalized than that backwater that Mr. Garfield and I first knew. These are our official portraits by Matthew Brady as President-elect and First Lady-elect. I guess I'm not elected, so I guess I'm just the incoming First Lady at this point. It was a very busy but pleasant summer when we had the campaign here in Mentor. But you can see that we might be a little worse for the wear here in our photographs as we embark on a very serious job as president and his family. The inaugural day, March 4th, 1881, the day started out very raw and disagreeable. But it cleared around noon, just about the time that the festivities were going to be conducted. And there was such a crowd in front of the Capitol that I have never seen before. And I feel that my husband, with the inspiration of the time and occasion lifting him into his fullest grandeur, became almost superhuman when he spoke his inaugural speech. To say I was proud is beyond measure. Even as a shy, reserved woman, I didn't relish the idea of becoming First Lady and having my family out in public so much. But when my husband was the candidate, of course I wanted him to win, and he included me in many of his strategies. And so this was the pinnacle of that successful campaign. After the inauguration ceremonies, we watched the grand parade from a viewing stand that was built right out front of the president's house. I'm told this is the first time that there was a viewing stand like this for the parade, but it was much appreciated to keep us from the elements that day. Again, crowds of people. The second building of the Smithsonian Institution was completed just in time for my husband's inaugural ball. We call that the Arts and Industries Building. This is the way it looked as it was being constructed. This was going to be America's Closet. The Centennial Exposition that had taken place in Philadelphia in 1876 to celebrate our country's 100th anniversary had many statues and things left over, and the Smithsonian's second building was going to house many of those pieces. For us, it looked like this. Fixed up for the inaugural ball with President Garfield's cipher on the left, Chester Arthur, his vice president's cipher on the right, a wonderful Statue of Liberty, Woman of Liberty with gas lights, and decorated for a promenade concert presented by John Philip Sousa and another conductor who conducted the Germania Band that evening. The festivities went on for hours. I wore a magnificent dress of lavender satin and had a corsage of pansies as part of my outfit. We received guests, crowds of people. Until about 11:30 p.m., we didn't dance. I have to admit, Mr. Garfield is not fond of dancing, so we stayed and talked to folks and shook many hands and left about 11:30 p.m. This is from the booklet, the Inauguration Ball program, just showing you a bit of the layout of the space. The president and I went to the executive mansion to sleep that evening among the shadows of the past 80 years of presidents who had lived in this house. I was so exhausted that I don't recall having a dream that evening. I just slept soundly, no dreams. I decided that keeping a diary was going to be so important to look back on as we began our adventure in the mansion. And you know, in some ways, this house became a family sanctuary. So many times, Congressman Garfield was out stumping for the Republican Party every fall, away from home. Sometimes he had congressional duties that took him out west to negotiate with the Indians or other duties as a congressman. So he was away from home a lot. But now, here we were in the executive mansion as a family, having meals together, spending quite a bit of time together. And so in a way, it was the closest we had all been with one another in quite a while. However, there was a constant flurry those first few weeks of people coming and going in the White House, mainly office seekers. And these men lined the halls. They made our threadbare carpets even worse, spitting their tobacco juice and missing the spittoons. There was a lineup every day. Here's my husband with his cabinet and what the executive office looks like. And that's a generous picture because, again, there's some threadbare carpeting in there. The drapes have some pieces missing where people have taken souvenirs with their pen knives. Some of the woodwork has little nicks out of it as well. This is the people's house as well as the president's house. And as long as you have shoes and a shirt on, anyone is welcome to come visit. And so it is getting a bit run down. I know that you hear this about every 4 years, about the condition of the house itself. But because it's open to so many people, it really does need some attention every so many years. I think that Mr. Garfield and I, the President and I, have decided we are going to ask Congress for some appropriations to help us refurbish the executive mansion. This is the children's official portrait at the White House by Matthew Brady. A little bit older than those earlier pictures you saw them. Hal is the tall young man, starting to get a bit of side whiskers. Jim is to his left. Molly, of course, seated in the chair, and then Irvin and Abram on the right. We lost our poor little Edward, who we called Nettie, from whooping cough before his second birthday. So we only took 5 of the 7 children that we had to the White House, to the executive mansion. Now, having a young family in the White House has its own troubles. The newspaper said that we had a lively but normal household, but lots of trouble to keep those little shavers straight. And just a few examples. So a week or so ago, Irv and Abram were in fisticuffs at the dinner table and had to be dismissed. We didn't want them to continue while we had guests for dinner that evening. The boxing gloves there represent that. And then a few days later, Irvin is riding his bicycle down the grand stairway right into the East Room. At the shock of the staff that was in there, they had to jump out of the way, otherwise they would have been run over by Irvin and his friends, the Burnett children. But I have to say that I am so proud of daughter Molly. She planned a tea luncheon for 10 young ladies, little girls that are daughters of the men in my husband's cabinet, as well as some other important men on the Capitol Hill. And she was wise enough to know, without me even telling her, that she should seat Fannie Hayes to Molly's right as the most important young lady at the tea, having been the former president's daughter. And so she conducted a lovely tea luncheon for 10 of her friends. So we do have that to contrast with those boys. Sometimes they could be little barbarians. The star is the stairway that Irvin traveled down and went through the cross hall into the East Room abruptly with his bicycle. And there's the East Room. Actually, it looks quite nice there. But can you picture the bicycle in that room with the servants jumping out of the way? One of the duties as First Lady is to host receptions a couple days a week. I chose Tuesdays and Fridays, and I held them in the green room. Up till now, those are the 2 days I'm staying with. Luckily, Mr. Garfield has come in to help me on a number of occasions, because once again, you were there for a couple of hours shaking hands endlessly. The room is important social space, you could say. The etiquette in Washington is very determined, and you are expected to have this type of gathering a couple times a week. And I have to admit, I am much more comfortable in a library than I am in a drawing room. So the Secretary of State's wife, Harriet Blaine, took me under her wing, and she has really helped me quite a bit in navigating the social norms that I need to know about. You know, I have to watch everything I say, otherwise it becomes fodder for the newspapers, and I dare not embarrass my husband. Here's the state dining room. We have had a couple of diplomatic receptions so far. We also had the gentleman from the Army and Navy come for dinner. So we have had a few occasions for a little bit of pomp and circumstance in the executive mansion. This is more the typical scene of our family here, with the president's mother sort of at the center of the room along with me, and then the children all gathered around. It's hard to predict what the next few years will be like for President Garfield and me. You know, we're just at the beginning of our 4-year term. He's a young man, 48 years old. He could have 4 more years, I suppose. Maybe even 4 more beyond that. There's no law against it. But I'm hoping that I can create a warm, hospitable house with a sense of history in the executive mansion. Since we have such a young family, I want to do the refurbishing, but also I want to learn more about the history of the people that came before us. So, with that in mind, President Garfield and I have just gone to see Mr. Spofford, the librarian at the Library of Congress. He has pulled a number of great books for us about the history of the president's house and its building, and starting with the Adams as the first occupants. And so we hope to get some more information and get going with that project. As I say, asking for appropriations from Congress, because I do have my eye on some carpeting at Sloan's in New York City to take the place of some of the threadbare carpets. I would like to tell you all how much I appreciate you being here this evening. It's always nice to be amongst friends and neighbors that are in Lake County. And I hope upon hope that I shall not disappoint you, my fellow Ohioans, during my stay at the Executive Mansion. With your good wishes, I will try to rise to every occasion with fine tact and faultless taste. Thank you very much.